All right, I think we should go ahead and get started in the interest of time so that we have as much time to spend with everybody as possible. So with that, good morning and welcome everyone to our plenary panel, second in the series of plenaries for this year's Natural Hazards Workshop. Our panel is on culturally relevant, community-guided, and scientifically informed information and action. The panel has grown out of the Rising Voices Center for Indigenous and Earth Sciences at the National Center for Atmospheric Research up the road here in Boulder, Colorado, if you're local. Thank you so much to the workshop organizers for the opportunity to share with you all, and thank you all for joining us early in the morning as we're navigating this virtual space and way to come together. We welcome you to, certainly make comments in the chat. It's really great to have this way to sort of keep interaction flowing as we're listening to the panel and keep interactions happening. So we appreciate you all for being here. Thank you so much. The Rising Voices Center facilitates intercultural, relational-based approaches for understanding and adapting to extreme weather and climate events, climate variability, and climate change. The center brings Indigenous and non-Indigenous scientific professionals, tribal and community leaders, environmental and communication experts, students, educators, and artists from across the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii, and the Pacific Islands, the Caribbean islands, and around the world, together to assess critical community needs and to pursue joint research that's really aimed at developing optimal plans for community action towards sustainability. So Rising Voices we really work to remove the boundaries between science and society and acknowledge the inherent value of Indigenous knowledge systems, practices, and Indigenous science, the adaptive practices and processes that Indigenous systems hold, and we honor those equally with earth sciences. Further, we understand that there's an opportunity cost to not having all knowledge systems brought to bear on the challenges that we face today, including those that we started speaking about yesterday at the beginning of the workshop on Sunday. And these are, from climate change to COVID-19, right? And we cannot afford that cost, nor the injustices that are perpetuated when people most at risk are not involved in making the research and management decisions that affect them and really affect all of us. So this morning, we want to speak to a gap in natural hazards management, which is that Indigenous voices, knowledges, sciences, and wisdom are too often missing in this arena. And so we've brought together, I'm going to keep these remarks really brief because we want to hear from the panelists, and we've brought together all of whom have been part of the Rising Voices Center for years. And we've asked them to reflect on a question: how do we build the spaces in earth sciences and hazards management where connections between diverse knowledge systems and practices can drive transformative change? Panelists will offer their reflections on this question and why they are each hopeful that collectively we will be able to act for transformative change. I will hand things over to Julie Maldonado from the Livelihoods Knowledge Exchange Network, and along with myself, we're co-directors of the Rising Voices Center. And Julie will provide some introductions to the panelists before we ask them to chime in and reflect on that question. And then in the last half hour or so, we will open up for questions and answers with all of you. And in the last few minutes, we'll provide a few closing comments and hand things over to Lori Peak to transition us out of the session. So with that, over to you, Julie.
Thank you, Heather, and everyone for being here with us, however early or late in the morning it is, depending where you are. Hope you all have your coffee and ready to join us this morning. So yeah, I'm really excited to have the honor of introducing you to our 5 esteemed panelists this morning. They'll all do more full introductions themselves when they're speaking. But for now, to kind of let you know who these folks are, who are really been core partners in the Rising Voices Center for Earth and Indigenous Sciences, and have made what it's become even possible. And so with us, we have Ava Hamilton, a Arapaho historian and activist, long affiliated with Rising Voices. We have Bill Thomas, longtime partner with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Office of Coastal Management. James Rattling-Leaf Sr., who's the principal with Rattling-Leaf Consulting and also with the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. Paulette Blanchard, a PhD candidate in geography at the University of Kansas, and also a fellow with the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And we have Dr. Michelle Montgomery, who is an associate professor and assistant director of Office of Undergraduate Education at the University of Washington, Tacoma. And so for our time together this morning, really, as Heather mentioned, we've invited the panelists to reflect on this question of how do we build the spaces in earth sciences and hazard management where connections between diverse systems of knowledge and practice can drive transformative change. And so we've asked, the panelists will be discussing among themselves for about the next hour or so before we open up that conversation to audience's questions for our remaining time together. And with that, I hope that Michelle, Dr. Montgomery will please start us off and kick off the discussion in reflecting on this question and really thinking about how we can be driving transformative change. So with that, Michelle, over to you.
Pinahipi, Talahaka everyone for joining us today. Pataxanixian Michelle Montgomery. I am Halawasaponi in Eastern Band Cherokee. But before I begin sharing my thoughts for the question that we were assigned to kind of unpack a little bit more, I just want to acknowledge the traditional territories in which I work, which is the Puyallup Nation, and the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples. So this subject is quite sensitive to me. I'm from an area where we're consistently impacted by hurricanes, and we're excited to also share that the Atlantic Coast Pipeline has been halted for now. And so I'm really excited about that. But, as a person who is consistently just in-depthly working in Indigenous critical pedagogy, I think one of the things that we need to be consistent of when we're talking about impacts in communities is how do we call people into a conversation. But when we call people into a conversation, I think one of the major responsibilities that we have to acknowledge is that knowledge has an inherent amount of responsibility. With that knowledge, we know that there's a reciprocity that takes place of sharing that knowledge of place, because there's an emotional connection to place. It's directly connected to our identities as Indigenous peoples. And I think it's important for us when we call people into conversation, we also have to acknowledge that when we ask the question of how do we create synergies to work around some of the complex issues of different areas that are impacted by climate change and other human factors, what is the emotional connection to place? But most importantly, acknowledging that if knowledge has a responsibility, how do we plant the seed of responsibility? How do we plant the seed of responsibility in sharing that there's all of these different synergies, but they come from a different cultural context? And I think some of the most troubling conversations that we can often have is not acknowledging the voices in which we come from, those place-based identities. And as a forever student, I'm constantly really pushing forth the notion of planting the seed of responsibility, calling people into a conversation, and acknowledging that there's always an emotional connection to place. And so with that, that's my perspective to the question, how do we do this? And we have to bring people to the table where voices are often not acknowledged. And it's also about decolonizing and indigenizing the narrative. For many, many years, we've seen numerous examples of how our narratives are told for us versus Indigenous communities being at the table. But for me, this is really about a cultural belief and being reminded. I'm constantly reminded by my elders, what type of human being do you want to be remembered as? But most importantly, if the ask has a responsibility, are you ready for the ask? And when you ask the question, are you ready for the responsibility of the answer? And so I'll leave that to my panelist members to piggyback off that, if that's okay.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I think that has certainly already started us off with a lot for folks to be reflecting on and thinking about in their own lives and experiences. Would anyone like to jump in from the panel and continue from where Michelle left off? Not everyone at once in this early morning.
Really, this is Bill. I'll go ahead and jump in. There's a lot to unpack here. And, what I'd like to do is give a little bit of perspective to add on to what Michelle said, especially about knowledge and responsibilities, but also it's not just that connection to that place, but it's also the lens through which we see these issues and which we see life. And I'd like to make a point. And one of the things that I often hear is that Indigenous people, and especially with Native Hawaiians, I hear that a lot, are anti-science. But if you think about this, and this is history, that around the time that Hawaiian society reached the zenith for navigation and sustainable agriculture and aquaculture, the Catholic Church in Europe was actually persecuting scientists for their heretical views of Christianity. Michael Servetus, he was a Spanish physician credited with discovering the pulmonary circulation, was imprisoned and burned at the stake. The astronomer Galileo Galilei spent the last half of his life in prison for his support of heliocentrism. And no wonder those of us who question, because of this history, we question the wisdom of destroying the various ecosystem services, our relatives, that allow us to survive, and reject the notion that we are opposing science. To Native Hawaiian scientists like myself, at least I used to be one, rather than a bureaucrat at this point. And we've cited a plethora of scientific challenges, including how our fields have influenced ecosystems and human evolution. And it's not my experience that Hawaiian religion or culture has been a problem with Western science, or has a problem with Western science. Science is actually a part of culture. And how science is done depends on the culture in which it's practiced. So ethical science is inherently responsive to society, to me. And in our excitement, though, to herald new avenues of research, we must ensure that we're doing so within appropriate bounds. As Michelle said, responsibilities. And we must try to determine whether the price that we pay will be of benefit to those that we serve. And I always say serve because and most of us are in the sector of public service. But it really is a responsibility that we have to those that we serve and how we get to this point. Well, there's a lot more to talk about this, and I'd like to pass on to somebody else to sort of take off with this as well.
Thank you, Bill. And also from what you said too, and from reflecting on what Michelle shared, I think a commonality that's already emerging is thinking about, why is it important that we bring these knowledges together? Why does that matter, right? Why is that so critical even in this moment in time? And so if anyone would like to share any thoughts on that, as well as the kind of framing question.
Julie, this is Ava. I'll say a few words about my observations of what's going on around the planet today. And we're, for the first time in a long time, I think it's a historical time because the whole planet is experiencing the same dilemma of the COVID virus. And all sorts of things are happening. People are coming together. All sorts of people are coming together in protest for other things that have been pushed out by by this common experience of a natural disaster. And but now the next question is, so now we're coming together where we are recognizing our humanity. We are people of all communities marching around and expressing outrage at the narrative of history and wanting to know, to change. And the question is what? Well, what are we going to do? What is, now that we can come together peacefully and otherwise, we're coming together because of this virus. Would we have come together, and would all of these protests be going on around the world? And but there's danger for us, for humanity, for our existence. So all of these knowledges, we're all in danger. They're all in danger of continuing to do their work. Our indigenous knowledges, our scientific knowledge, is we are all focused on how it's being focused politically. I think people are wanting to have, direction, or I think they need it. Not they want it, but they really need it on what is the next step to really change how we exist as living beings with all the other living beings, and for us to continue to exist in the future. That's just one of my observations as I continue to isolate, watch TV, and read on the internet people's responses to how we're trying to ride out and to be healthy, isolating ourselves. But there's a lot of hope out there. I am so happy that we are recognizing differences and expecting for ourselves, for and from ourselves, to do good things, to be useful human beings, and to continue to work to be better. And to me, that's what Rising Voices is. And it's also interpretation of different languages, like scientific language. I keep saying this because I always hear new words that I've never heard before, and I'm not a scientist, an academic scientist. And it's another language that in indigenous peoples at home, it just doesn't, it's not incorporated into an everyday language that they speak. So for me, Rising Voices was a place that I could just turn next door to a scientist and ask, what did that person mean? What does that mean? And they would know. And so I know a lot, now I know a lot of about the different terminology that scientists use, but for the non-scientists and communities who are trying to just survive on a daily basis, with trying to have drinking water and food, to have the scientific knowledge is not really all that important, but it is very important. Some of these changes that are happening, they're under the radar. Like I have a Navajo relative in Oklahoma, and she said that she just signed some papers for to bring water to her community. It's in Gallup. And I said, I asked where they're getting this water. Is it from the Colorado River? And she said, well, the Colorado River is polluted. They're getting the water somewhere in California. And that was news to me. But they're going to have try to have water there on the Navajo reservation. And I hadn't read anything out in the media on that and how that's going to happen, but I wonder if that's part of the changes that are going on. Anyway, thank you for listening to my ramble.
It's not a ramble, Ava. We always love hearing from you.
Thanks.
Oesi Wapani, Niwikiniki, Noki Nahalawa Makiki. My name's Paulette Blanchard. I'm absentee Shawnee. I'm a grad student from the University of Kansas and a fellow at UCAR. Good morning, relatives. Nice to see everyone. And I kind of want to reflect on several of these topics. I mean, the first question was, how do we create space, or build spaces that are transformative spaces in science education, knowledge, hazards. I kind of want to really kind of point at the fact that, we're talking about building spaces when we've always existed, really, I mean, it's not like, you're creating something new. It's just now in the white stream system, we're allowing other voices to be heard finally, because the hubris of science and the hubris of the power structure that has been, and from colonialism and from imperialism and all, and even nationalism, has started to recognize its own weaknesses, failures, shortcomings. And so, as Native peoples and mixed, diverse peoples, we've always existed, and our knowledges and our technologies have always existed in place. And places, bringing it back to Michelle's discussion about our relationships of place, Indigenous people have always understood the patterns and the cycles, because we've existed in those and depended on those and followed them as closely as possible. And what I find interesting is that Western Eurocentric science tends to ignore the patterns or try to study these patterns and dismiss the outliers, where Indigenous knowledges and sciences already understand the patterns and look to the outliers, because we believe those outliers are where revolution and evolution and diversity happens. And those are sometimes the magic markers that we learn how to adapt. Those little differences sometimes are often the differences of life and death and survival and perish. And so for me, recognizing, these diverse thinkings, the need to step beyond this idea of a monotheistic science, I guess you could say. Deloria reflected frequently, Vine Deloria Jr. reflected frequently how science is almost religion-like, that if you speak against it or outside of what is accepted, and by who, we have to remember who decides what's accepted, then we can be considered blasphemous and unscientific and unrespectable. So as a Native person who gets the opportunity, who has had the opportunity to work with multiple tribes across multiple regions on their understandings of, I literally had a white male scientist tell me that Indians didn't know the difference between weather and climate. And so I set out to prove that, and it wasn't hard to prove that, Indians clearly know the difference, and they have very specific details. And so to look at how Indigenous knowledges, place-based knowledges, and sciences and technologies that come from those places are deeply ingrained in not only language, culture, identity, everyday lived experiences, and the patterns of these lives. I've learned a lot about diverse thinking, and when we want to expand our knowledges in a system that has been for so long controlled by specific power holders, it's going to be disruptive at times, and it's going to be uncomfortable, and it's going to challenge everybody's thinking, and that's good. We need to be uncomfortable. We need to think differently. We need to be open to the ideas, because just because we don't understand how another group processes through their own worldview what is happening doesn't mean that it's wrong or that it's less scientific. It's just that is the way their culture has produced their knowledge systems of not only learning and embedding it into their daily lives, but also the transmission and the perpetuation and passing on of these knowledges. You know, I like to look at it as like, we've heard about the 4 R's of research. You know, I like to look at the 7 R's, which are the 4 R's, or the 7 R's I look at are respect, relevance, reciprocity, relatedness, responsibility, relationships, and redistribution. Now, when we apply those 7 things in our daily lives of understanding ourselves and our own existence, but also trying to understand others, you know, we can get a pretty good understanding of not only ourselves, but our relationship and our relatedness to others. And I'm not talking just the human others, but the more than human, the other than human others, you know, the plants, the animals, the waters, the patterns of place. And then our responsibilities and those relationships that we build long-term, short-term, and over generations. And then the redistribution is, how do we disseminate that knowledge? And one of the things I love about watching and learning from young Native students is the relevance of their research. They come into science, they come into hazards, they come into academia and school with they already know the problems that they want to address, because often these are things that are impacting them in their homelands. And so they come into sciences with a problem, you know, that is relevant to the community, to themselves, to the future of their people sometimes. And it's up to us to be forgiving enough in science to allow them to look at science from their own perspective, which is the diversity. So science education in education has to start so much earlier in a way that is permissive and not just accepting, but completely supportive of diverse ways of thinking, knowing, doing science, and, you know, which folds into hazards. Because for tens of thousands of years plus, even depending on what theories you like to be respectful to and learn from, Indigenous people have survived many pandemics. They've survived many natural hazards and environmental transitions. The difference is historically we had a larger region we could move and go from one place to another, to not deplete a resource, to not to allow an area to heal that maybe had been impacted by drought, fire, tornado, flood, whatever. And now we're trapped to place based on a colonial system that is not our own. So all of these things have to be not only adapted to, but we have to be forgiving with each other and ourselves to try to figure out these new ways. And it's going to take a lot of diverse thinking, which requires us to change the way we teach, not just in upper academia, but especially in the K through 12 system, because we are teaching a system that is Eurocentric, it's erasive and extractive, it's does a lot of violence to other ways of thinking, knowing, and doing. So, you know, the K through 12 system has to be changed, and that requires us to change how we teach our teachers in the academic system, in the university, because we're putting out the same thing over and over again of this cookie cutter type of educator. And so we have to change how we teach our teachers to teach. And that requires, you know, innovation, that requires diversity. And because once we can get those teachers teaching differently, we can get these young people learning differently and learning things that are more holistic or more realistic, you know, and of the world that we've lived in and currently occupy, and that which we hope to eventually create. And so that's going to have to allow for radical thinking. You know, one of the things I've loved about Rising Voices is that we've grown. we've started in one place and really stretched to try to create an inclusive environment. And along the way, we are continually growing, whether it's recognizing gender identity and gender powers, or if it's, looking at racial and cultural diversities, beyond the indigenous and beyond the Western Eurocentric science systems, and being more inclusive of both urban and rural communities. When we talk about how do we create these spaces, it's really comes back to this idea of like Heather and Julie, I hear them frequently say, making the invisible visible. For Native people to find space in STEM and in sciences, high sciences like atmospheric sciences, earth sciences, hazards, and FEMA, and all of these things, requires us to be in these spaces. We have to be there has to be intentional actions to make sure that all peoples are represented, and not just lip service, but people that are culturally competent, that are scientifically sensitive, rigorous, and capable, and that have compassion and understand multiple sides of the same earth that we all live on. And so I know I've seen, why does this have to be radical? I mean, anytime, because change can be radical. I mean, we've been ingrained in a system that has been structured, and sometimes we have to step out of the box and realize that everything's not binary, black and white, right or wrong. There's a gradient. There's a lot of variabilities of intersectionality. And we have to appreciate those intersectionalities and those differences, and not be so afraid of them or judgmental or resistant of them. So I'll stop there and let other people speak.
Thank you so much, Paula. And one question, I know a couple folks, I was trying to follow the chat a bit, a couple of folks had asked to repeat the 7 R's. If you wouldn't mind just sharing that.
Well, if somebody else would like to speak, I'll type them so that people can save them if they'd like, if that's okay.
Thank
And
you.
it'll also be in my upcoming article that I'm about ready to publish.
So that was a kind of a little highlight foregrounding to what is to come in Paulette's full research article that we highly encourage folks to be reading soon, and we will be sure to be sending around when that gets out. I'd like to ask James, do you have any kind of reflecting points from, what Paulette started sharing was, really thinking about how, we've framed kind of this question around, how we think about making these connection points, but, some of the things Paulette left on was, thinking about what are some of these real kind of distinct actions and steps that people can be taking, in the spaces where they are, whether, in that case, is really talking about educators and teachers, but we can imagine, right, all the different areas that this needs to be happening in. And curious if you have kind of any reflecting thoughts on that.
Well, thank you, Julie. And again, good morning to the audience this morning. Let me just say, hihani washte, daya yahi, hamidake pichante washte nape jusapolo, James Rallingly from Machiapina, Shuchanga Lokoto Yate. I greet you all with a good heart and a handshake, and it's good to be here. This is my first time being part of a natural hazards workshop, and also honored to be with the Rising Voices panelists today. Just good to see everybody. We greet each other that way, just because that's our cultural protocols. And again, if you don't know what a protocol is, it's those sort of things, those values that we adhere to and that we're taught to by our families and our parents and our elders. And so we try to do those things, whether it's on an online platform like Zoom or whether we're in person. But good to be with you. And I think a lot of the ideas, thoughts, wisdom, knowledge has been shared. I would agree with. One of the things I would say, and I did also listen to the workshop presentations on Sunday. I did listen to the keynote on Monday. And I was real interested in the theme of active hope. Active hope. And, I don't, at least in my experience, I've never been in a lot of science organizations that talked about hope. and that value or in that virtue. And I think they, at least from my perspective, so I'm Lakota from South Dakota. Maybe I'll just back up a little bit and say, hey, we had 3 big things happen this week that raises the visibility of American Indian or Indigenous people. First was the Standing Rock Dapple decision. The second was a McGirt decision, Supreme Court decision. And then finally is the Washington NFL team mascot change. So what happens when American Indian issues or American Indian things come to the forefront, when the mainstream media covers our stuff? And so I always go back and think about, well, what's the motivation behind a lot of this stuff? In particular, organizations that want to work with Indigenous people. And so I kind of go back to the past. I think history matters. I think context for understanding matters, and I think we got to do that. I think there's no shortcuts in working with Indigenous people. There's no shortcuts in creating these spaces you're mentioning about, where it can be developed with respect and reflection. I think in 2020, again, in my experience, that when people talk about working with Indigenous people, I always wonder what the motivation is again. So that's number one. I think number two is, I think, Dr. Lori Peek is onto something here. And everything I heard these last few days, her name came up a lot. People are commenting on her leadership and, her willingness to work across many different disciplines, organizations. And so I think for practical purposes, I think this particular event as a plenary, says a lot. It's raising the visibility, again, of Indigenous issues, Indigenous people, and Indigenous organizations. So we need to work with Lori Peek. Leadership matters in these kind of things, and as Paulette mentioned about power structures and dynamics and how people make decisions, where funding and resources go. We still struggle at that as tribal governments, tribal colleges, and tribal organizations. We're working in my part of the country. I just saw a really great presentation yesterday about a new group coming up. So I live in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and that group's called the Indian Collective. Indian Collective. It's an ecosystem. It's kind of funny to hear like regular us Indian guys talk about ecosystem, but it's an ecosystem. It's really looking at a systemic approach to the issues that we face as Indian people today, from the economics, from land, from culture, from education, climate change, environmental justice, social movements, and things like that. So things are happening in our communities. Things are happening in our part of the world. You may not hear about it unless it's a Supreme Court case like the McGirt case, but nevertheless, there's a lot of activity happening in the country. And I guess this space we're talking about, I believe there's an opportunity, or what they call windows of opportunity, WOOs. I like that, WOOs, WOO. There's these windows of opportunities now, I think, with all the attention now on diversity, attention on inclusion, attention on justice. So I think the time is now to mobilize and to come together, to take advantage of this time with the people here that want to work with Indigenous people. And I think we can work with them. I think we could work together to better understand how we work together. And finally, I think just beginning to sort of develop a sort of this new paradigm of relationships, built on respect, honor, and trust. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James. And some of what you raised there with thinking about, I love the woo. I'm definitely going to be borrowing that. That's fantastic. And thinking about, reflecting on the overall theme of this convening of active hope. And you touched on some of those actions that are happening in this moment, some that are national, international news, some that are localized and just as important people might not be necessarily hearing about, but they add up cumulatively to help create that transformative change. And I'm curious to hear, kind of circling back around the group, of reflecting on this idea of active hope and thinking about some of those actions that you would love to see. There's a pretty diverse audience we have here with us today, right, who works in all different varying spaces. You know, what are thoughts and, you know, recommendations that you like to share, that you want to see being put into action, right? On the ground action in how you really bring these diverse systems of knowledge and practice together, you know, kind of what gives you hope that is possible, right? That this change is upon us. You know, Paulette touched on some of that with thinking about, you know, it's when we think about education, we have to educate the educators, right? You know, so I'm curious if anyone would like to kind of jump in and thinking about, you know, what's that hope that you hold for thinking about those actions to be put into place to really think about that transformative change?
Well, I think one of the things that I just would like to bring back full circle, I noticed in some of the comments in the chat box, you know, we also, before I mention what the hope is, we also need to acknowledge that, you know, a lot of the words we use are very colonial words. And in many of our languages, we do not have a word for research or science. When we think of the word ecosystem, to many of us, that rings relative, you know, so we're taught two responsibilities: the teachings of our non-human relatives, and the second responsibility is to remember them and honor those teachings. And I think the misconception with the word science is a very Western, colonized word that it's taught in so many different ways to be static. It's not asking you to be fluid. It's saying A plus B equals C. When we, you know, I can only speak for myself as a forever student. You know, when I think of the word science, it comes across often as quite sterile, because if knowledge systems come from relatives, then it's living knowledge, and therefore it's not placed in a particular box. But for conversation's sake, I understand that word exchanges are flipped back and forth, but I just wanted to share to the audience that in many indigenous communities, there isn't a word that says science or research. And science, from that perspective, when you think about how do we bring the diversity, my hope is that we acknowledge at some point in the conversations is that we welcome to bring our whole selves. The missing component, and when we talk about disasters and place-based and all the other different infrastructures, is the process of emotion. Where's the spirituality and emotion? And my hope is that when we start using colonial words in our conversations, we also acknowledge that that's not the only word that is available to unpack a lot of the issues that are surrounding our communities. But my hope is that in all of this stillness that we're in, that we're virtual for a reason, right? And so the stillness, and I'm hoping, is that we create a rebirthing process. Because in order for us to create the needed change versus re-exchanging the same words of how to create change each year, we have to find within ourselves, are we ready for the responsibility? And so the hope for me is that as we're sitting in the stillness of a pandemic, and climate change is still happening while we're in the stillness, is that individual people are really digging deep. What do you want to work on, right? And we can talk all day as a group, but you know, unless we really place the responsibility on that question of hope, like, are you ready for the responsibility of that? And I think that's where I stand with hope, is really engaging people in a conversation. Where do you stand with that? If you practice forms of erasure, how do you stop doing that? If you practice very strong colonial ways of being and knowing that's very exclusionary, how do you stop that? And I think that's why this panel, to me, is quite empowering, is that we have an opportunity to say exactly what we're saying.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And something that, you know, Michelle and Paulette and others here have often reminded all of us is the importance of what it means to bring your whole selves to this work, to this engagement. And I've been really appreciative of their teachings of about all of the intersectionalities that exist in all of us, right? We all bring so much different representation, and remembering and honoring that and respecting that through each other. And Paulette, sorry, yeah, it looked like you were gonna.
Yeah, I would like to kind of, one of the things that really struck me and made me expand my own thinking and realize sometimes my own short-sightedness was when a friend of mine who's Two-Spirit talked about their experience during one of the hurricanes down in Louisiana, and talked about that when it comes to people who are trans, people that are openly LGBT plus, there wasn't a space for them to feel safe. They couldn't even use a bathroom and feel safe doing it. And they talked about the exclusion they felt during a natural disaster when it came to trying to assist communities, whereas the communities were treated as male and female, but not supportive of the gradient of gender identity and such. And that really made me start evaluating how I look at, you know, disaster and science. And when we had our Two-Spirit panel at Rising Voices, many of the things that kept coming to the surface was the ability to look at science from the perspective of a gay lens, or through a trans lens, to talk about the things that we might not think of as cis people. When it comes to how science impacts these diversities, these intersections. And it was really powerful to bring those into those kinds of discussions into the center of what we try to do in earth sciences. And indigenous science has always tried to respect and recognize these diverse peoples in our communities, because everybody has a place, everybody has a value, everybody has worth, and we try to support that. But with the Western system, this Eurocentric system, the white stream system, it's not always so. And so it's important that when we talk about diversity and education and science and hazards even, that we talk about these intersections, these diversities. These are very, very important and real and existing differences that have to be supported and addressed and thought about.
You know, I wanted to share this as well. Talk about creating spaces. I think for the audience, again, is sort of real curious. I don't know if we have a poll or nothing here, but I'd be curious to know how many of the audience here today understands and can apply the unique relationship of tribal governments have with the U.S. government. Do they know that we have something called treaties? And do they know that defines a unique relationship that's still a bit different than a stakeholder? I think that also has to be part of the solution of understanding again our unique role and what does that mean in terms of working together. I also say that part of that space that we're talking about is a linkage to decision making. Again, is that when we think about how we make decisions based on, as Paula mentioned, a Eurocentric model versus an indigenous model, I think those are also key understandings that need to be developed. If it's the Natural Hazard Center being one of those places, or in collaboration with the Rising Voices Center, it's great we're having all these centers. I just hope that we can work together using them. I think it's requiring that today. I think we need to break down those silos that keeps us from doing the work that we need to do, especially when I think that work that impacts Indian country, because we know that there is an inequity there. There's an equity in resources and education and opportunity. So it's going to require leadership, and it's going to require maybe a new kind of leadership that needs to come from this community. So I would share that.
Thank you so much, Jim. Looks like Paul, you were ready to respond. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to take a little bit on that as well. Is that everything we're talking about right here is really about the value of investing in relationships. And let me give you an example. In 2009, there's an earthquake and tsunami in Samoa. And, you know, as soon as it happened, the community mobilized, and those are responsible actually started cleaning up everything. And in American Samoa, the main island, there's all these little streams, and they build roads over and stuff like that. Well, they cleared them and started building. FEMA came in and told them to stop because we didn't know what it looks like before, so we'll give you the check later. And that's without understanding the culture again, through which they're dealing with a disaster. And these are American citizens as well. And they come in often from the outside to help to respond, but without putting that investment up front to understand the culture in which you're dealing with. You know, so that investment is really important. Excuse me. Because, you know, within Rising Voices, and I'm sure even within the Natural Hazards Center, and I'll point to PRIMO, the Pacific Risk Management Ohana, that's been around going into our 18th year now, that's brought all of, we've had Lori there, we've had Lori's predecessor at PRIMO, we've had Julie, Heather, you've been there, Paulette, you've been there. I think we all try to leverage one another and provide these spaces, because what we find is that within our organizations, our respective organizations, and you know, whether it's Rising Voices or PRIMO or Natural Hazards Center, or for me within the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, we find that the questions of social and environmental justice are often intertwined with the deeper metaphysical questions of connection and meaning that Michelle had mentioned earlier. And this inevitably gives rise to questions of human rights, Paulette, indigenous rights, James, and environmental rights, all of us. And those are all one and the same. And it's within this context, we have to challenge researchers and government leaders to cultivate mutually conducive and appropriate principles, protocols, and practices that address humanity's collective need to sustain our landscapes and demonstrate the ability not only to maintain human life, but more crucially to the interrelated more than human biosphere, which includes that spiritual component, because that's really what connects us to everything around us. You know, we've seen these discussions, and we have to continue to seriously engage in these discussions concerning how scientific paradigms. So I'm not just talking about Western science, I'm including indigenous science as well. You know, how these paradigms might collaborate and the protocols that need to be identified or created to enable a successful collaboration or collaborations. The thing that's unique with Rising Voices and with the Pacific Risk Management Ohana is that we always start off with protocol. And it's recognizing the people of the places that we're at and understanding that they are the ones that give us permission. We ask permission first, which is something so fundamental yet, even within the realm of science that I've dealt with for most of my life. When you ask somebody, have you asked permission to be here? I get a look like, what are you talking about? What are you going to do with the data? Who has control of that? How is this helping those that you're taking information from? What is your kickback? What is your reciprocity? Those are questions that I've asked forever. So when we talk about transformation is going to take a long time, so we need to take the long view. But it does happen. And for me, when you talk about active hope, I've seen the changes over my 40 plus years of doing this type of stuff. And seeing that it took almost 20 years to get the word ahupa within our, which is a Hawaiian word for land management, and the philosophies and the tie to the spiritual world, as well as the world that we live in. And getting that actually into not just a federal lexicon, but into regulations. It took time, but it's there. The fact that we are here in this conversation within the Natural Hazards Center with the sponsors that we have shows that there is progress being made, and there's recognition that we actually have value. And I can't tell you how many times I've been told that Hawaiians don't do science. Paulette, you've heard that. James, I'm sure you've heard that. Yet that's our background. You know, coming from the background that I have, you know, living as a Hawaiian, you know, the last name of Thomas is always challenging. But I grew up in a family that was very supportive, and I learned all of my Hawaiian traditions through my family that carried on into my sciences. And I see that me being supported with my different views of the way in which things can be done there is progress. So there is hope that these things, I think that we're on the cusp of doing some really great things and making these momentous changes. But what we have to understand is that the important part is what Paulette had alluded to and what Michelle had alluded to, and what we continue to talk about within Rising Voices and with Primo is the value of the next generation coming up and how we need to prepare for them. We're not doing a great job of preparing them right now. So we need to be able to do that. We need to do better than that. And also, don't be surprised, and I looked at Paulette a couple of years ago when we were in Duluth for this panel at the end, because Paulette, as you can see, is one that pushes the next generation, which is the only way that we can actually continue to exist as a people, as a culture. But don't be surprised when the next generation keeps pushing you, because that's the way it's always been, and that's the way it always should be, because that's the only way that we can evolve as a culture, as a society, to sustain ourselves and remember those things that actually brought us here. And, you know, again, speaking within a science organization like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration was challenging at times. But now we're getting support for this. And again, I do see hope because of the things that we're doing in Rising Voices, the people that we have in it, and how it grows. I'll leave it with that, because if I start talking, I can go on forever. But I'd like to hear others' reflections on this as well as been a part of this conversation for a long time.
Thank you so much, Bill. And personally, I'd prefer to stay here all day. And so not to take over the workshop, but, you know, we could just go on forever. But I would like to, you know, a couple of things that you said there, especially in thinking about the power of these connections together and really framing this around a lot of kind of, you know, through a narrative, and the power of the story that you're telling. And, you know, I'm curious, I'd like to, you know, Ava, not to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot a little, you know, where you come from in your artistry and filmmaking and the power of being an Arapaho, you know, where you live and continue to thrive of, you know, if you wouldn't mind sharing some of your reflections on this, the power of stories, of telling and listening and that narrative, and, you know, how the stories can help transform some of these spaces that have seemed so, you know, immobile and kind of immune to change for far too long. You know, if you have kind of any reflections just from your own work and experiences and thinking about that, really that power of stories and storytelling.
Yeah, I do. When you grow up in your own tribal community, you know, I grew up where when I walked outside, I could look down the road and see houses of aunts and uncles and grandparents. I lived, you know, where allotments were, you know, of your relatives. And then when I went to school, the only tribe that was there were Arapaho kids, and with a few white farmer kids who, you know what, they spoke Arapaho too. They spoke as much Arapaho slang as we did, and they really, that was my first experience of having friends with other people other than Arapaho people. But I had a really Arapaho experience growing up, and part of that teaching, along with going to public school, part of that teaching was in storytelling. And our stories were not just stories. Most of the stories taught you something. They were teaching, and they used imagination. I mean, we had mermaids. We had other kind of imaginary people that we knew were elements of the story of all life, living, that there's life everywhere you go and that you must have respect for it. So, and I heard all kinds of things. I heard about people going over to London, and it's a crazy, I've mentioned this before, but one of my grandpas was William Shakespeare, and he was one of the people who went over to you know, these groups of Indians who were travel over to Europe and do storytelling and different things, that dances and songs, and they would tell crazy stories that I learned about different people. And one time, this Susie Yellowtail, a Crow woman who was part of that trip to England, was talking about, she said, "Oh, remember, Bill, when you had all those redheads in your room?" You know, and they would tell stories like that. And then they said, "Remember when we all got on the elevator and there were fleas jumping out of our nice Cody's wig?" So, you know, we learned things about relationships of different tribal people, and we this is where I got my influences into learning about other people's culture, other tribal cultures. I know a lot of people because of the people who had friendships from different tribes, and I know a lot of history. My Grandpa Bill was involved with that Miss Indian America activity there in Sheridan, and we used to go over there. And when we camped there in tribes, and the Blackfeet always had teepees, had colorful teepees, and we go over there, and that expression teepee creeping comes to mind. But we were very young when it first started, and got to camp with and visit other tribes, and storytelling was a major part of the adults. We were free to roam around with all the activities that were going up there, but we were camped with other tribes. And when the adults got together, and somehow they knew, even though there were no phones and travel was, not everyone had transportation, had cars, you could go over there and hear these really old stories about the land and about the people. And that's really precious experience to me. My life being as old as I am and hearing stories that explain relationships to plants, animals, and to our world. It's different than today. The Hollywood explains the success of a film by box office dollars. But that's not how our storytelling is. It's teaching. So for me, living around here in Boulder in an urban area, it's not really an urban area in my mind. It's a place where my people lived, and I've learned things about Boulder, and one of the things about the Flatirons is that the naming of places, it's not Boulder's name, but the name of the place where Enkar is a place where it's steep. And that's what I learned about place names. There's kind of an effort to today to name places, rename places for cultural significance. And the place from the Arapaho way is that it's the action of what that place does. That's its name. It's not named for white people who discovered it or who colonized the place. So there's storytelling in the Indian world is really key. It holds our history. It holds our imaginations of what we cannot see and what we can't hear. Our imaginations, our brains are really important to our connection to the past, and that's what it is, and to the future. The past, present, and future are not separate. They are the same. They are one thing, and it's us. That's who we are. We are the past, present, and the future. So what we do with our storytelling, which is education, which is our knowledges, is to make a good story for all of our people to understand and to love who we are and the world we live in, Mother Earth, and all of the elements, the beauty of life. And storytelling is really hopeful, brings hope to me when I see young people telling these stories using new technology. I still use that term, new technology, which is cameras and editing equipment, to tell our stories and to give us hope, but for us to tell our own stories. I agree with the philosophy, and I got this from the young people, is that if it's not by us, it's not about us, and that we should really be telling our own stories. And there are other things that come into play with telling these stories, intellectual and cultural property, which is, for me, in the beginning, I thought that it would protect us because we are the ones who have the right to tell a story. We have the right to represent this information. But if you go through the law with intellectual and cultural property, it has a limitation. It expires. The protection expires. So I think that that's one of the tasks and the responsibilities we have as tribal peoples, is to protect. How do we protect our information, our knowledges? Today.
Ava brings up a really incredible point, and I say this because I was just responding to this comment of objectivity. Historically, what has happened is that non-Indigenous scientists come in and they see us doing something and they assume that we're doing it for what other purpose in their mind flavors why they would do it, and often don't understand the misappropriation of knowledge has happened since contact. And often things are taken out of context or without the rest of the story that often Indigenous people apply, which becomes the responsibility, the relationship, the rest of the reciprocity, and all of these things that go along with a process or a system or a knowledge base. And so I think it's important that, you know, when Ava's talking about the stories and these cultural aspects that come along with knowledge and science and technologies of place and people, that we remember that historically science has gotten it wrong when they come in with their ideas of what they think they know, and apply what they know to what they think they know, and often get it wrong. And so that's something that we're constantly trying to correct or realign. And so it's important. I'm glad that she brings up these things of how we learn and how we hold on to and process and redistribute knowledge and information, and the process of science, of observation and testing, and you know, going over and over again until we have a confident understanding, and then making sure that the redistribution of that information gets done appropriately and in a way that it makes sense to us in our world, of the relevance of what we do and what we know. So thank you, Ava, for bringing that up, and I hope that people catch on to those little bits and pieces that she and others are sharing.
Yeah, Bill.
Yeah, I'm glad Ava brought up storytelling, and because it's such a valuable part of what we're doing. There are a couple things in this. Is that, you know, I was fortunate to go to school, Kamehameha Schools, School for Hawaiian Kids in Hawaii, growing up through that. And in 6th grade, we had Mrs. Curtis come every Friday to tell us stories, Hawaiian stories, and the stories are about basically why we do the things we do, what are the basis for them. It has stuck with me since then. But working with the American Geophysical Union, we talk about active hope. And, you know, thank you, Rod Pandia, for all of his help in this. But we're going into our 4th year now of having a session on the value of storytelling. It's really finding the quantitative within the qualitative way in which the stories are told. That these stories just aren't stories, but they hold valuable information. It's a way of communicating science. So that is being brought to the forefront. We've been doing that for decades, ever since I can remember in Hawaii. So I'm fortunate to have brought it through that and be able to bring that to this. But we always talk about storytelling as being that extremely valuable place in which we could understand why we do things, because in the end, we don't do things because somebody says we have to do this, this, and this, and this, and this. We do these things because that's what we're supposed to do. So it becomes more reflexive than reflective. I mean, that's the state that we eventually want to be in, as anybody that's inhabiting any place, especially when you become adapted to that place, it becomes reflexive. So stories are key and fundamental to us being able to do that. And those are the things that are going to hold the youth as we bring them forward into someday being those that are sitting around the table coming up with these solutions. And let me put in one plug for the youth, is that I was and Paulette was at this meeting with Dan Wildcat and I last year at the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians Climate Symposium. And there was a legislator from the state of Oregon that got up, and she's a native, I don't remember which tribe she was from, but she looked at all of the youth and said, hey, you know what, if you guys want to really do something, one of the things you can do is run for dog catcher, run for your local council, run for the House of Representatives, run for Congress. Get into those positions where you can actually use your knowledge to be those that can make those decisions to change. So I'll put that out there because as being one of the few Hawaiians in the federal government, I know what it can mean. I know what you have to go through, but I know what it can mean in order to make those changes. So we need more of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill, and to Bill and others who have definitely been leading the way and showing, that change does not necessarily happen overnight, but when you look back across time and you see how far you've come from where you started, and that's one of the critical lessons I think folks like Bill have really exemplified and taught with, especially a lot of the youth and students coming up, right, who are so anxious for that transformation and recognizing this is long-term work, right, over time and over generations. But to continue on, and that, as Bill's, you often talked about, and Bob would, of, teaching about, you're always setting that table for the next folks coming, right? You're always setting the table for that next generation. And I'd like to transition a bit now. We have a few minutes left still for some questions. We've been trying to pull them out as folks. It's been awesome seeing the chats coming in. What I'm going to do is, for all the panelists, I'm putting in a question into the chat now that seemed to, I don't think we're going to be able to get to all the questions, but trying to find some that have been reflecting on some of the conversation where we've gotten to at this point. And this question, who is from, I believe, a Daniel Green, shared, is there a distinction to be made between science as a methodology, which is a value-neutral approach to understanding the world we live in, as, quote, science as a justification, where findings are used to promote things such as ethnocentrism, colonialism, or are the two themselves interconnected to a point where they're indistinguishable? I realize that's a big question, so it's in the chat box for folks to be seeing. So if you just want to take a second to kind of reflect on that, and if anyone has responses they'd like to share.
I would just like to say that, first and foremost, when we have these sorts of conversations, when people come from different lived experiences, different backgrounds in general, one of the rules of thumb when we have engagement about subject content that people have been so invested in is to learn how to agree to disagree with grace. So I just want to put that out there. But when we think about the way that we're using words, I think words are so powerful. So when we think about the way we use words like Western science versus indigenous ways of being and knowing, I want to reiterate that there are synergies in both, right? I think there are synergies in the ways that there's methods and methodology. So, a method is, the steps, and the methodology is the theoretical framework. I said, but there's synergies, right? But the complexities that are often overlooked or not engaged about is often how the complexities often carry a particular agenda that recreates the exclusion process, right? So all the voices aren't at the table. So I think, you know, it's a bigger way to unpack that. So how would one view a method? How would one view a methodology? Is a very unique conversation. And I would say that I just want to put out there, you know, like our indigenous languages is both a method and a methodology. Our storytelling is both a method and methodology. That spiritual emotional connection to place is a method and methodology. And I think when we learn how to accept different ways of being and knowing and different knowledge systems, I said, then that's when we can all come to the table and have find a common ground to where we can find synergies to work together. Doesn't necessarily mean that everyone needs to adapt the same ways of being and knowing, right? Because we all, those of indigenous peoples, we all come from different places and we have different ways in being. And I just wanted to put that out there, you know, there's a big difference, right? And I think that that goes back to what I said initially. How do we call people into a conversation to have this specific conversation? But how do we do that with grace, right? While trying to find synergies without discrediting, you know, other knowledge systems, because that's definitely not the point of this panel. It really is, where are the synergies? How do we create, you know, lines of communications so that we can find the synergies? And each of us have different things that we love to work on that we're very passionate about. So it doesn't mean that we're going to choose a very broad net to cast in all the different knowledge systems. That's just my point.
I'll also contribute here. You know, I've been sort of working with this idea of call it ethical space. And when I, at least if I understand the question, if they talk about distinctiveness between the sort of indigenous ways of knowing and Western approach sciences, I think that, you know, Western science is going to keep doing what it does despite what I say. Indigenous people, from where I come from, you know, we're on a path for self-determination and sovereignty and decolonization. And so trying to find a place where those two things can come together requires maybe a third space, or this ethical space that I am working with myself. And I think what it does is it honors the integrity of both systems. And I think that trying to change one or integrate them or merge them, or I'm very careful about using those kind of words anymore, just because I think you know that we need to, you know, we need to respect those things and also know what they are. And so I think that third space, the critical space, the ethical space, is a place where it creates greater understanding, and I think allows people to be who they are. It's almost like, how can you change? How can you change but still stay the same?
I really appreciate that discussion of like not integrating or trying to force one into the other, or trying to make, you know, blend indigenous science into Western sciences. Because one of the great things about indigenous knowledge and indigenous sciences and technologies is that they're very place-based. And you can't always pick that method and that methodology from that place and guarantee it's going to work somewhere else, but you can take bits and pieces of it. And it's not like we're throwing out Western Eurocentric science and saying it's bad, because that's not even remotely the truth. We're saying that that is one way, and it's like yes and instead of a but, you know, it's like yes and there are other ways, and here are some other ideas and methods and perspectives and problems and some solutions that have worked in these other places and spaces and times that might be applicable. And, you know, it's not like, you know, we're trying to bring back the past and live in the past, because Native people have we've always been dynamic and, you know, adaptive and creative. And we recognize that art is part of science. We recognize that language and song and you know, you can't dream without all of these things. And science often comes with dream or from dream. And that's one of the things that has been exercised, I guess if you want to call it that, from mainstream science systems, is this acceptance of the metaphysics of modern existence, as Deloria likes to speak about, of recognizing that we don't just force through numbers ideas, that some of these ideas are manifested through something beyond us and something bigger and outside of us, sometimes in the subconscious or in the universe. And my great grandmother used to tell me, the universe is big. We don't quite exactly understand how big, because our minds aren't there yet to understand and wrap ourselves around it, although we try very hard and we understand it's very big. But there are things that happen that we can't quite define or explain yet, and we just have to accept that they are, and someday we'll get there. But until then, we can't just be dismissive and say, oh, it doesn't exist because we can't explain it. And that's the wonderfulness of being accepting and understanding and open to diverse knowledge systems, is being willing to explore the unknown in a way that doesn't have to force it into a definable space, that it doesn't have to be labeled yet, and that it's okay to dream, because a lot of very evolutionary and revolutionary and modern expansion of thought comes from, subconscious and accidents, even, those crazy outliers, So one of the things that I do hope we take from this conversation is that idea of being patient with us as humans. We're spiritual beings learning to be human, and to continue that process, but also not to exclude the spiritual, and to recognize that these are incredibly important to us as beings, as human beings, but also as cohabitating beings on a planet that is in itself dynamic and alive, and has systems and processes of aging and renewal that, we have to recognize, we don't have any control over. And the only through respect and, recognizing the relatedness and the relationship of place, that we can learn to cohabitate in a healthy, good way.
I like to reflect on the language part, and what Michelle also talked about, the synergies. And this is solely from the Hawaiian perspective, just where I'm coming from. But let me give an example. So the protectors of our land use the word kapu about how the aina, the land, should be treated. And this concept was translated as restricted or forbidden, or even holy or sacred. And how do we get to such a broad spectrum of meanings here? Well, Hawaiian was an oral language, and it was written to word, translated by Protestant missionaries, intent on converting the natives. This essentially entrenched Western interpretations of Hawaiian concepts. Didn't quite get it right. So to Hawaiians, kapu requires us as members of society to exercise caution, to question whether an action should be taken, recognizing that which is kapu, in need of being regulated or set aside, is a cornerstone of Hawaiian values of caring for the people in the place. And strictures on how to interact with the land abound in our traditional songs, in our chants, oral histories, in our dances. But Western science also adheres to kapu as well, and it's called ethics. And we must take this responsibility to the public and to the environment seriously. No field of science, as I mentioned earlier, exists outside the spheres of culture. And no matter how far our ship takes us out to sea, the process of agreeing on codes of ethics are often imperfect. Yet, what I see in Hawaii, and another place in the Pacific as well, is that the scientific community continues to grapple sincerely with the morality of new research, such as work on stem cells, gene editing, and climate engineering. So continued reflection on the principles underlying science and our culture is a good thing. And I'm heartened by this type of conversation and the direction many of these conversations have gone over the years. Now, I mentioned I've been doing this for over 4 years, and transformation takes a long time. But reflecting back what Julie said, when I reflect back on it, it seems like it was yesterday. So as you get older, maybe it's going to look faster. I don't know. But I think we need to keep in mind the history of how we got to where we are in order to understand what we need to do to lead us to the future. And again, the youth are so valuable and so important, and we need to have those stories and the history behind all of these things to help them figure out the solutions of the future.
Thank you so much, Bill. And as we transition now kind of to this closing, I'd like to say, I think it's quite obvious why it's been pretty much the biggest privilege of our personal and working in all existence of getting to have all of you as mentors and guides through this journey, and forever grateful for being students to you all, and so deeply appreciative of your time and emotional energy in this. I'd like to ask Ava if you have kind of any, I never want to say final words, but just for the moment, a few words to share, and then we'll transition. Heather will just say a quick closing and hand it over to Lori. So Heather, Ava, if there's anything you'd like to share.
Oh, thank you. First of all, I'm really super grateful for the existence of Rising Voices. And it's an inclusive place of indigenous knowledges, indigenous knowledge holders, indigenous people, scientists, both indigenous peoples who are scientists and people who aren't indigenous. I've learned a lot. I'm like Michelle, who said she's a constant student. I am a constant learner, and there's so much to learn. There's still a lot to learn, and it seems like the natural world is speaking to us, and there are more people who are hearing that natural world and speaking in that way, that giving voice to that world that doesn't speak our language, doesn't speak English or any tribal language, but speaks through our hearts and our minds. And that's a really major commonality that's coming out in the world, is that I watched an international channel about Japan, and there's a Chinese station, and other places in Europe and here in the United States, is that we are concerned about life and existing. How are we going to exist in the future? And to be thankful for all that has brought us to this place. Even that virus is a major player in who we are today. In the natural world, we are just one of the elements. The humans are just one of the elements, and we need to work with life, all life. And I just want to give thanks for that, for all of the work that everyone is doing, all of the knowledge that we gain here to become better beings in our world. And I'm learning too. I'm a constant learner. And our knowledge holders, it is of great concern to us all, because they are looking for younger people to pass on this knowledge, this responsibility. And it is a great responsibility, because it's survival. It's actually survival in the kind of world that we have today, of place. And we all need to work to support that. If you know, it's not enough to know right now. It's not enough to know. We have to figure it out, and we're very intelligent beings. We can figure it out and work together so that we can, our young people and our world can exist in the future, and things are changing. But that's all I have to say. I love everything. I love life. I love peace, and I wish that on everybody. For
Thank you so
everybody.
much, Ava. That is the perfect peak with which to end our conversation together for today. Again, this is Heather Lazarus. Thank you all so much for being part of our discussion and the activity in the chat. I think just a final comment, a final reflection here from what I've been hearing for the last hour and a half. Diversity doesn't mean just who's at the table, who is in the office. It means how we do what we do, the processes that acknowledge and allow people to be their whole selves, bringing their teachings and their wisdoms from really deep backgrounds. Thank you for everybody for talking about that, for why it's important to use plural for sciences, knowledges, and practices, right? For listening, needing to listen with open ears and whole hearts. And just so much gratitude to all of you for gently and importantly helping us with this conversation, leading towards how we activate hope moving forward for transformative change. As I said at the beginning, in the face of the crises that we have in our world today, we cannot afford the opportunity cost of not creating the space with our Indigenous partners and colleagues for more diversity of knowledges and practices in science and in hazards. So again, thank you all so much. We are at time, and I really appreciate the engagement and questions so greatly. We're going to turn very briefly to Lori so that she can make a few announcements to all participants. And again, thank you all so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Heather and Julie for organizing this panel, for proposing this panel, for bringing this panel to all of us at this workshop. Thank you from the bottom of all of our hearts. And to Paulette, Michelle, Bill, James, and Ava, coming from a place of complete gratitude. I want to share with you something that Kate Brown put in the chat. She said, "Thank you, panelists, for such big ideas offered with love." And so thank you for bringing these big ideas to us. Thank you for the many rising voices that you just allowed us to witness and to join with here at this workshop. And so we're going to transition to a break now, but first I have a couple of announcements for our workshop participants. And so I'm going to share my screen really quickly so we can actually see something here that I wanted to share, that Elise Bernbach has been recording all of the different sessions, including this one. And so what we're going to have from this session, as well as from our prior sessions, are going to be a series of different images and graphics, and we cannot wait to see the one from this plenary session. This is the one from yesterday's, The Realities We Face. And we've just been asked if we could to please see Scott Miles' chats in the main feed loop portal so that you can see where you can all contribute to a mural that she is building for all of us. And so I hope you will go to the forum that Scott has set up. And then also I wanted to remind everyone that the Disaster Dash you can run anytime this summer, but tomorrow is sort of the day when we're hoping everybody will engage in the virtual Disaster Dash to support the Bill Anderson Fund 501c3 and the extraordinary students in the Bill Anderson Fund who are transforming hazards mitigation and disaster research. And so please sign up and dash with us tomorrow or whenever you can. And then finally, to all of our workshop participants, we hope that you have a restorative break, and we will see you back here in 27 minutes when we launch our next plenary session that's going to pick up the conversation that was started here. So again, thank you, Julie, Heather, James, Bill, Ava, Paulette, and Michelle for all that you are. We'll see you soon. Thank you.
Hello?
I will be signing off and
Is
taking
this-
a nap before my next one.
Nice. Thank you, everybody. That was an incredible conversation.
Yeah, that was great.
Great
Bill, what-
questions.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
Bill, the day's just starting.
That is like the longest sunrise I've ever seen, Bill.
You should be here to see it.
I might be, because Mark and I are talking about coming out and seeing Kalani, so.
Good.
I'm just gonna stay in this space because I don't want to go do anything else.
Okay. Do we meet after this?
I don't.
Did you all get the information if you want to participate in any of the other sessions? Did you get like your login info?
Mhm.
Yeah.
But also, I meant to let y'all know what time? Well, let's see here, Mountain Time. At 1